A man can spend 40 years perfecting the art of needing no one and call it strength the entire time. He can build a life so self-sufficient that nobody ever thinks to check on him, mistaking the silence for peace. You have seen him standing in that silence, and you have never once questioned whether it was actually comfortable. He fixes his own roof, files his own taxes, and drives himself to the hospital without telling anyone he's going. That is not independence in the way it presents itself. That is a wound wearing the uniform of competence, and the uniform fits so well that even he forgets it is a costume. I watch him hand back the tools before anyone can finish offering help, and the refusal arrives faster than the thought behind it. He does not decide in any conscious sense not to need people around him. He has simply forgotten that needing was ever considered an option worth entertaining in the first place. You recognize this pattern the instant someone tells you they are fine, and you notice the answer arrived before the question finished. Something underneath that reflex has never been named in his presence, and it does not appear to want to be. The fastest way to hide a wound is to dress it as a virtue, and self-reliance has always made an excellent disguise for exactly this purpose. He was taught to wear it before he ever understood what the disguise was covering underneath. I keep noticing that the wearing never stops, not alone, not at night, not even when no one remains to be impressed by it. That absence of an audience should have relaxed something inside him, at least occasionally, at least once. It did not relax anything at all, not even in private, which means the performance was never really staged for anyone else to witness in the first place. The state beneath his composure still has no name, and that namelessness is precisely what keeps the whole pattern running undisturbed. A behavior without a name cannot be questioned, because questioning requires a word to point toward, and no word has ever been handed to him for this particular condition. He learned early that speaking a problem aloud converts it into a burden placed on someone else's shoulders, so he stopped speaking. Not from pride exactly, but from a private accounting system that treats every disclosure as an unpaid debt. I watch him carry disappointment the same way he carries physical pain, efficiently, quietly, as though narrating it aloud would somehow make it heavier rather than lighter to hold. You have noticed that he changes the subject within seconds of anything resembling vulnerability, and the shift happens so smoothly it barely registers as avoidance at all. It registers instead as maturity, as composure, as the behavior of a man who simply does not need to dwell. That confusion between avoidance and maturity is not accidental, and it was never meant to be easily separated. He was rewarded for this exact confusion for most of his life, and reward repeated long enough stops feeling like performance and starts feeling like identity itself. I notice how many of his daily behaviors have little to do with practical necessity and everything to do with quietly proving that he still can. He mows the lawn himself when a service would cost him far less than an hour of his own labor. He repairs the fence alone in the rain rather than accept help that was in fact freely and sincerely offered to him. You begin to see that competence for a man like this functions less like a skill and more like a shield against an unasked question. That shield has been raised for years against a question nobody has actually spoken aloud to him. The question underneath is simple, and it has almost never been spoken aloud between the two of you. Are you actually all right underneath all of this, and not merely functioning well enough to pass? He would not know how to answer honestly even if the question arrived, because answering requires a vocabulary he was never permitted to develop. This can no longer be explained by personality alone, not once the same pattern keeps repeating in front of you. A single man behaving this way could be dismissed as an anomaly, a private quirk, an isolated habit worth no further attention.
An entire generation behaving this way is a pattern instead, and patterns always point outward before they ever point back inward. I start examining what surrounded him while this shield was being forged, because a shield this uniform across so many men suggests a shared forge rather than a private choice. The economy he entered told him, repeatedly and without apology, That stability was never guaranteed to anyone who trusted it blindly. He watched institutions fail people who had placed their faith in them, and he drew the obvious conclusion that trust itself was the underlying design flaw. Technology arrived during his adult years rather than his childhood, meaning he had to adapt to it instead of being shaped by it from the beginning. Adaptation, unlike immersion from birth, always leaves behind a seam, a visible line where the old self meets the new demand. That seam is precisely where he learned to solve problems alone, because the tools were too new for anyone older to teach him properly. The people his own age were too occupied managing their own seams to compare notes or to admit that anyone needed help at all. You can see how isolation, once genuinely useful for survival, quietly became the default setting applied to everything else in his life. Labor changed underneath him as well, shifting from something stable and visible into something increasingly precarious and entirely self-managed. A man who must manage his own employment learns, without ever meaning to manage his own emotions in exactly the same private, unsupervised way. I noticed that the emotional culture surrounding him offered almost no permission for men to describe internal states beyond simple function. Tired, fine, busy, done. 4 words considered a complete and sufficient emotional vocabulary, and he was never handed a 5th one to use. Responsibility landed on him early and stayed there permanently, often assigned to people who were never equipped to reciprocate it fairly. Responsibility carried without reciprocity does not build character so much as it quietly builds distance, first from others and eventually from himself. Each of these conditions alone might explain a single habit, nothing more, nothing especially alarming on its own. Together, they explain an entire structure, and structures rarely operate through a single mechanism working in isolation. They operate through layers instead, each one compensating for whatever the layer above it failed to fully resolve on its own. You start to sense that what looked like a personal trait is actually an architecture, assembled without any architect. It was built from decades of separate pressures that never once consulted each other directly. I recognize that no single adaptation could have produced a pattern this consistent across so many men who never met one another. There must be several mechanisms operating simultaneously, each reinforcing the others, each one hidden carefully behind the one that came before it. 7 distinct layers become visible once you stop looking at the man himself and start looking at the system quietly running beneath him. Behavior comes first, because behavior is the only part that can actually be seen from the outside. Habit sits beneath that, because habit repeated often enough stops functioning as a conscious choice at all. Identity sits beneath habit, because a habit repeated long enough eventually becomes who a person sincerely believes he is. Responsibility sits beneath identity, because identity organizes itself entirely around what a person feels he owes to other people. Relationships sit beneath responsibility, because every obligation quietly reshapes who is allowed close and who is kept permanently at a distance. Meaning sits beneath relationships, because a person eventually needs a private reason the distance was worth maintaining for so long. And beneath meaning sits a blind spot shared by an entire generation, invisible precisely because everyone inside it assumes this is simply how the world works. The moment this 7th layer is named, the investigation has nowhere left to go but back to the very first one. Naming a structure changes nothing about the pattern still quietly running beneath it. Layer 1 begins with what can be observed directly, without interpretation, without explanation, without any added meaning attached to it yet. I watch him decline help using nearly identical language every single time. A slight laugh, a wave of the hand, a passing comment about being perfectly fine. He performs self-sufficiency even in situations where it costs him considerably more than accepting help would have cost him. He stays late finishing alone what two people could have completed together in a fraction of the time. You recognize this pattern because you have personally offered help to a man like this and felt the offer bounce off something before it ever landed. Once the behavior itself becomes visible, an obvious question naturally follows close behind it.
What allows a pattern like this to repeat so consistently across so many separate, unconnected instances of his life? The answer sits one layer beneath the surface, inside the mechanism that keeps producing the same behavior long after its original purpose has quietly expired. I noticed that avoiding help once relieved him of something quite specific, an obligation, an exposure, a moment of appearing incapable. That moment always occurred in front of someone whose opinion genuinely mattered to him. He repeated the avoidance because it worked reliably, and repetition without correction rarely stays a mere strategy for very long. It becomes a reflex instead, one that fires before conscious evaluation ever gets the chance to occur at all. You can see the reflex operating even in situations where the original threat no longer exists in any real sense. The mechanism never checks whether the danger is still genuinely present in the room. It only checks whether the pattern has ever failed to protect him before, and so far, by his own private accounting, it never has. Once a mechanism can only survive through constant repetition, a further and more uncomfortable question emerges almost immediately afterward. What happens to a person after decades of a single mechanism repeating without any real interruption along the way? That question belongs entirely to the layers sitting directly beneath this one. I notice that his refusals no longer feel like conscious decisions to him at all. Not anymore. Not after this many years. A reflex practiced for 30 years stops registering as a reflex and starts registering instead as simply who a person is. He no longer experiences a genuine moment of choice before declining an offer of help from anyone close to him. The declining has folded itself so deeply into his self-concept that removing it would feel less like breaking a habit and more like losing a limb entirely. You sense that what began as pure protection has quietly hardened into identity, and identity resists correction even long after the original danger has fully disappeared. Something real has been lost in that slow transformation, and the loss is not obvious from the outside because self-reliance still photographs beautifully as strength. The next question becomes unavoidable at this point in the investigation. What exactly disappeared while this identity was quietly solidifying around him over so many years? I noticed that what disappeared was the ordinary, unremarkable experience of being supported without ever having to ask for it first. He carries that specific absence inside behavior that looks completely unremarkable, arriving early, staying late, quietly handling logistics no one ever requested from him directly. You recognize the loss precisely because it vanished so quietly that most people, including him, never registered it as a loss at all. They registered it instead as simply normal, and normal is exactly where a cost hides most effectively from view. The moment that loss becomes visible, it generates its own limit, because no one can indefinitely sustain a structure built around an absence he refuses to name. That limit becomes the doorway into the next layer, and this layer is still not the final one waiting ahead. Layer 4 begins with responsibility, and responsibility for a man shaped this particular way functions less like a choice and more like an inherited weight he cannot recall being handed. I watch him take on obligations that were never explicitly assigned to him by anyone, managing a parent's finances, absorbing a friend's crisis without complaint. He becomes the fixed point around which other people's instability quietly orbits, year after year, without ever once naming the arrangement out loud. He does all of this without complaint because complaint would require describing a burden, and describing a burden would require admitting one truly exists. You notice that the people around him rarely see the actual weight because he has spent years ensuring that weight remains carefully invisible to everyone. Each new obligation gets treated as simply one more item on a list, rather than one more brick added to a structure with a finite capacity. The obvious question follows almost immediately after this realization sets in. What happens to closeness when one person is always, permanently, the one holding everything steady for everyone else? That question opens directly into the layer sitting just beneath it. Layer 5 is relationships, and here the architecture reveals its clearest and most measurable cost of all. I notice how his relationships are organized entirely around competence rather than intimacy, around admiration rather than any genuine mutual exposure between two people. He is trusted, relied upon, and consistently described as dependable, but almost never described by anyone as a person others quietly worry about. Worry requires visible need, and visible need is precisely what he has spent decades systematically eliminating from view, one small refusal at a time. You sense that real closeness requires two people occasionally needing each other, taking turns, trading places between strength and vulnerability, without keeping score. A structure built entirely around never needing anything cannot produce that kind of closeness no matter how long it is carefully maintained.
Something about this arrangement should feel hollow to him eventually, and the fact that it still does not raises the next unavoidable question. What does a person quietly tell himself to make an arrangement like this feel sufficient, decade after decade, without ever revisiting it? Layer 6 is meaning, and meaning is exactly where the entire structure finally receives its lasting justification. I notice that he has built a private narrative in which self-reliance is not really a defense at all, but a form of quiet respect toward others. He believes, without ever examining it too closely, that needing less makes him more valuable, rather than simply less reachable to the people around him. You recognize that this belief allows every other layer to remain fully intact, because as long as the story holds together, nothing underneath demands scrutiny. The story feels coherent enough to survive examination from almost anyone, including himself, and coherence is exactly what keeps it unexamined for an entire lifetime. Beneath that coherence sits one final layer, and this one does not belong to him alone in any meaningful sense. Layer 7 is a blind spot shared by an entire generation of men, invisible precisely because it functions as the water they have all been swimming in. I notice that this blind spot treats emotional need as a private malfunction rather than as a widely shared condition across an entire cohort. He assumes his loneliness is evidence of something uniquely wrong with him, rather than evidence of a structure applied almost identically across countless other men. You can see, once this final layer is named, that the isolation was never really private in the first place, despite feeling that way to everyone inside it. Almost nobody within the generation has ever said this plainly to another man, and that silence is exactly what allows the blind spot to persist. A blind spot requiring collective silence to survive will use that very silence to remain unnamed for as long as it possibly can. There is no deeper layer waiting beneath this one, because the investigation has reached the point where the structure begins explaining itself rather than pointing further downward. What becomes visible now is not a new discovery exactly, but a different way of seeing everything already uncovered across the previous 6 layers. I look back across all 7 layers, not to summarize them individually, but to notice what they were quietly doing to each other the entire time. The behavior fed the habit, and the habit fed the identity forming underneath it. The identity organized the responsibility, and the responsibility shaped every relationship that followed after it. The relationships required a meaning strong enough to justify their particular shape, and the meaning depended entirely on the blind spot remaining unspoken. None of these 7 layers ever operated in true isolation, even though each one appeared from the inside like an isolated fact about a single man's life. You can see now that removing any single layer without addressing the others would simply allow the remaining 6 to quietly rebuild it around the gap. A structure this integrated does not release its weakest point easily. Instead, it reroutes around it and keeps functioning almost exactly as before. There is one final observation left, and it does not resolve anything, because resolution was never the shape this particular investigation was built to take. I notice that a man can spend his entire life inside this architecture without ever once being given the chance to view it from outside himself. The surrounding culture was constructed, gradually and without any single author, to keep this architecture invisible, mistaking silence for peace, and peace for a life fully lived. He remains, at the end of all this, exactly what he was at the very beginning, a pattern rather than a person fully examined and understood. A pattern is precisely what remains once the personal story surrounding it has finally been set aside and left unattended. You are left instead with the recognition that what once looked like an individual trait was a shared structure all along. It wore the face of a single life from the very first layer onward. The investigation stops here, not because the questions have run out entirely, but because this is the exact point where recognition itself becomes the only honest place left to stand. There is another phenomenon sitting just adjacent to this one, still unexplained, still waiting quietly beneath its own separate surface. He is not yet fully understood, not by the culture that originally shaped him, and not entirely even by the observation just completed here. You are invited to keep watching, not in order to find an answer, but to continue the exact same kind of attention that uncovered this one. The next pattern will not announce itself any louder than this one did, and it rarely ever does. Thank you for staying through the entire length of this particular psychological investigation, from its very first observation to its last. If a specific layer felt closer to something familiar than the others did, that recognition is worth naming quietly to yourself before moving on. It is also worth sharing in the comments below if you feel there is something useful in saying it out loud to someone else. Continuing to notice patterns like this one becomes considerably easier with a subscription and with notifications turned on for what comes next. The attention this required does not need to end here at the final line of this particular script. It only needs to continue, quietly, in exactly the same way it started at the very beginning.